This week I've been trying to use up some scrap wood on some jobs around the workshop. Prior to us buying this house, I spent all of my adult life living in apartments. I wasn't afraid of using the odd power tool indoors, and I always found myself needing a little bit of scrap wood, either to fix something or I guess for some random creative pursuit that I had on my mind at the time. And I always found it frustrating that I couldn't buy just small pieces from the store when I needed them. So now I've got this house and this workshop. I've filled this workshop with so much scrap wood that I'm beginning to feel burdened by it. I didn't have much going on in the workshop this week, so I decided I would start on a quest of trying to use up some of the scrap wood on a few inessential tasks around the workshop.
The workbenches in my workshop were here when we bought the house. I never really liked how they were bodged together with rough sawn timber and chipboard, but they have been respectably solid for the most part. I've had these plywood boxes I made about 15 years ago knocking around in the shop, and so about a year ago I decided to turn them into a drawer. Putting two of them together was slightly too deep for the workbench though, so I decided the solution was to build out the workbench so they wouldn't sit proud. I ended up surprisingly happy with this job. The workbench always felt solid, but now it looked solid too. Because it was mostly an exercise in aesthetics though, and because the southern bench was a bit longer than the timber I could get from the DIY store and fit in the car, I couldn't really justify doing the rest of the benches. It would have meant paying the specialist timber yard to deliver me a piece of timber that was the right length, and that didn't really seem worth it. I still had some scrap wood from the shelves in the old mid-room closet. I was thinking again about the workbench trim, and I had the idea of laminating a bunch of smaller bits together to make the big beam that I needed. There were surprisingly inconsistent thicknesses, and there wasn't quite enough timber there to do the entire job, but with a bit more scrap wood from elsewhere in the workshop, I had enough to stick together and build the piece I needed. I recut the ends at a consistent angle to scarf them together and began patiently gluing and clamping it all up. One of the scraps I was cobbling into this was the edge of an old door I trimmed down, which being from the 1970s was actually a really nice piece of pine. It needed a little milling down to the right thickness, but that worked alright, and I put it up in the glue up overnight. The next morning I was bemused to find that my entire glue up had fallen down due to my cavalier approach to clamping it all together, but thankfully no harm was done. I gave the face a quick sanding, ready for the last layer of timber to laminate onto the beam. Here's my regular diagram. At this point I wondered why on earth I thought this was a good idea. But with the clamps off, I gave it an aggressive sanding with Senorita Makita, and it began looking like it was worth it after all. While I was sanding it, I was pretty fascinated to see just how many layers of paint there were in the door offcut. With all the surfaces somewhat flattened, it still needed trimming down to the right thickness, and that also went okay. It wasn't exactly the pinnacle of straightness and squareness, but it was more than acceptable. I've definitely bought timber from a store that's proved to be just as warped as this was. I propped it up and it looked good in situ, so I trimmed a little rebate off the end where it could slide under the surface. Then confirmed that my measuring tools drawer could still open with the new trim in place before I finally screwed it in. As usual, a bit of filler and sanding went a long way to make it feel more solid, And this ridiculous scrapwood project proved to be worth doing. Next, I turned my attention to the dead space above that scrapwood drawer that I built under the northern workbench. It wasn't really a big deal because it was only scrapwood in the drawer, but it had a habit of collecting a lot of sawdust in there. So I began thinking about adding another drawer in the dead space. My measuring tool drawer has proven to be one of my favourite workshop upgrades, so I figured another drawer on the other side had the potential to be just as useful. I set about removing a random piece of floorboard Bob had screwed to the underside. And in the process of removing that, I realised the flaw with my plan.
What? Such a beautiful piece of floorboard, Bob.
Which was that putting a drawer under there to be flush with the front would impede my ability to put clamps under there when I'm working on the bench. I decided to pause on that idea until I figured out what the right compromise was. Now I had the trim on the north and south workbenches. It seemed like a pity to not have it on the remaining western workbench too. So I measured it up and found a piece of studding timber I also removed from the midroom. Which I figured I could mill up to match the rest of the trims. I faced off one edge, then observed that the other side had some pretty significant metal inclusions that weren't going to be practical to remove. So I decided the best way was to just plough through them, and I swapped to an older blade I had already knackered by hitting other bits of metal. And I let the sparks fly. I faced up the other sides too, and then lastly a bit more filler in some of the old nail holes did fine work in making it look like a decent piece of wood after all. I removed the vise an old neighbour gave me, which was a bit of a puzzle to get back out with my trim in the way. I said these benches were pretty solid, but the middle of this western section definitely wasn't. And I discovered the reason it was so saggy was because the only thing supporting it on this front side was this 20mm thick bit of rough sawn baton that wasn't screwed to anything but the top. I removed that and I began pondering how to attach my new trim piece, as the construction of this part of the bench was so different. I realised that by some good fortune, the back of the piece of the bench top was filled in by some more random scrapwood that happened to be exactly the thickness of my new trim piece. I decided it would be a good opportunity to remove the entire bench piece and reassemble it in at least a slightly stronger configuration than before. I doubled up the 2x1s I found back there to make 2x2s. Then instead of the width pieces just floating and hoping to be supportive, I screwed this new underframe together before screwing it back into the rest of the workbenches. It was immediately much less saggy. Because this piece now sat 40mm back from where it was before though, I had to trim a tiny bit off the tops on either side. I did this with the circular saw, which was easy in one direction but harder in the other, on account of the saw's motor being in the way. The e-chisel helped me tidy it up. Then after cutting a couple of notches out of the end of the new trim piece, it was willing to drop in. I dithered about where to reattach my vise. Having it so tucked into the corner was impractical sometimes, but I worried that having it less in the corner would make it more in the way when I wasn't using it. And having my new trim piece so thick meant the jaws wouldn't sit level with the top of the bench, unless I notched the trim out. I don't know if it's going to be weird like this. I'm sure if anyone watches my video, they'll tell me if it's really wrong to mount a vise like so. But I decided to take the least invasive path and I mounted it less in the corner and lower down, for now at least. So on the western side, I ended up making the workbench not only look stronger, but actually be a little stronger too, even if it's still not perfect. The compromise I ended up deciding on for my new drawer was to make the drawer slightly shallower than the maximum depth of the bench. I dreamt up a convoluted idea for a system to have it stop in two places, and I made the only new purchase of this entire project and video, a pair of cheap drawer runners, and I got those installed before measuring the gap between them. I dug around for some more scrap wood for this job. The best candidate was this last piece of poplar ply I had, which seemed a bit too nice to use on a random workshop drawer. Then I looked around for some material to make the sides of the drawer box from, and I found some mel-faced chipboard, which seemed not nice enough for the task. I decided that if I wasn't willing to use the MFC on this project, then it had to leave the workshop and not contribute to the scrapwood problem. Instead, I ended up finding this grubby old bit of ply that was starting to delaminate, and that would be good enough for a couple of the side pieces at least. Once the ply sides were cut to size, they seemed perfectly fine, and I ended up finding some scrap MDF that was acceptable for the front and back too. I cut a rebate into the sides for the bottom to slide into. And I decided to simply screw the base into the front and back, in case I ever want to salvage that poplar ply and swap it for some cheaper stuff in this place where it's never seen. I got it all glued, screwed and clamped together, with a bit of faffing. Then once the glue had all set up, I clipped it into the slides on the bench. This ended up being a bit stiff going in at the back of the bench. I guess the bench timbers I screwed the slides into weren't as straight as I thought they were. But this error ended up working really well for me in a funny sort of way, as the friction it causes at the back has allowed me to have the drawer in two positions without the need for any over-engineered nonsense. And so, to enable the drawer to go back as far as possible, I trimmed a little bit of the bench timbers away again with e-chisel, and got the front of the drawer fitted too. I then added what is becoming my standard finger pull, a 30mm hole with a 1/4 inch radius round over, and it seemed pretty good. Now, I never really had a plan for what was going in this drawer, but upon looking around the workshop there was a very obvious candidate, in the form of this fruit box on the counter, which is sort of vaguely full of sheet sanding papers and protective equipment. The legs on the box were just ever so slightly too tall for the drawer, but that was a really easy fix on the table saw, and the drawer quickly volunteered itself to be filled with all kinds of loose stuff from the workbenches. There was still one more piece to finish the trimming on the workbenches, and that was the totally unnecessary bit at the end of the southern bench. Short of chopping up another old timber stud, I didn't have a piece big enough for this either. So I found two pieces of old door frame that could be glued together to make what I needed. This glue up seemed like a breeze in comparison to the first one, and it milled up just fine. I couldn't remember how I attached the one to the other end, so here I used a couple of scraps of smaller studding that I found. I skipped the pilot hole and was punished, so I had to redo it.
That's not going to help anyone, is it?
But it worked well enough. Then I screwed down a quick guide and trimmed off the edges so the corner was consistent, before giving it all a good sanding. And it looks pretty good for it now.
I can't help but feel like I'm living in Bob's shadow when I work on a project like this, making things out of disparate scraps and offcuts of wood. I worry that the next person will come in and look at what I've done and wonder, why don't you just do it properly with good materials? So I just have to hope that I'm doing a better job with more consideration to how it looks and how it works. The irony is that I've used significant pieces of wood from pretty much every shelf and store of scrap wood that I have in the workshop, but you wouldn't even notice it to look. In fact, the small scraps drawer has ended up with more in it than when I started, which doesn't really seem to make any sense. So that's what I've been up to this week anyway, and the only thing left to do is to burn up the firewood scraps. Thank you for watching my videos.